Okay, first thing, Unit 5 journal. I just put it in as Journal 5 into Google Classroom. If you open up the journal, you should see the questions. There's 5 questions. When you do the reading, that is to help you answer questions 1 through 4. The 5th question we'll get to the end of today. Or Monday.
Yeah.
It's in we will not be here tomorrow.
Yep. Oh.
That's some pretty high expectations.
I got faith.
I think a late start.
Well, it's better at least you had, because I'm saying I'm something that. Read this. You gotta read this article and then answer the question. Right?
Yes, read the article, questions 1 through 4. Okay, and I mean, I guess you can. Question 5 is going to be the focus of most of the lesson today, so just read. At least I'll give you time to answer question 5 at the end.
How was that mystery part?
Okay. It's on the board what you need to do. can watch you guys at all times. Keep track of all your work at all times. That's crazy. Devin?
What?
Keep track of what you're doing. That's stalking. Why are you watching?
Why are you on my paper?
I'll give you a few more minutes. But looks like most people are getting done.
Done.
What's number 4? There's always more. Actually, you're going to thank me here in a second. You are about to thank me. Close your Chromebooks now. Close them, please. There will be time for you to do it later. Close them. Thank you very much. I'll figure it out. You can do it at home. I feel like that really happens though.
No got internet.
Alright, first of all, I want to talk about what you read. You guys think there are like good sources and it's like not so good sources?
Yeah.
But you guys think do you think I'm good at picking sources? Or are you suspicious? You think I Wikipedia it? If you guys are sophomores, so you're pretty new to this, but like, have you ever been taught like peer-reviewed sources? Have you even been taught how to do citations?
Yes.
Okay. Now, have you been taught like peer-reviewed sources, like scholarly sources, academic sources? You guys ever been taught that? You get. This is something that you have to do a lot in college, but I don't even really remember doing this in high school. You have to find what are called scholarly or peer-reviewed articles online, which means if it's scholarly or peer-reviewed, it's usually written by a professor, and then other professors will read it and say whether it's good or not. So your peers are reviewing it, and they're saying whether it's good or not. It's like a process to go through to determine whether it's legit, something that Wikipedia sites don't have to go through. But what I showed you was like an article written on the peer-reviewed article, like the shortened summary version. Now, if I really wanted to not be a nice guy, I could have had you read the whole thing right here. But they had written a summary on the actual paper itself. I was gonna assign this, but I'm assuming, Devin, are you glad I didn't? Because we got to the pretty good information in that short little summary itself. Like we didn't need to waste all of our time reading that. So
I don't think I would have read it.
you wouldn't have read it. That's why I'm a great teacher. Now the content of what you read, was it shocking at all to anyone, or did we already know about all this stuff? Knew about it. What were some terms that maybe jumped out at us? Any words jump off the page? Those words stand out at all? Plantation. If I say plantation, what do you guys think?
Before the Civil War.
Before slavery in the U.S. before the Civil War, where the slaves were, did that word appear in the reading?
Yes.
Okay, the plantation of Ulster. Now, all right, I'm not going to compare the situation of Irish people to slaves in America. It's a little bit different. They weren't slaves like African American slaves were, but what happened was, well, what did happen? What was the plantation of Ulster? So, well, who were the Gaelic Catholics? Who were the Gaelics? Who were the Gaels? Those are the Irish. Okay. Now remember this: for hundreds of years, Ireland was part of the British Empire. Okay. They broke off later on. The plantation of Ulster was a literal plantation system where over time the English had gained control over Ireland through war and politics, and they ruled Ireland. Well, what did they think of the Irish? What did the British think of the Irish? That they're like racially inferior. In fact, like at the time, white Europeans had created this hierarchy of, there's whites up here and down below are blacks, but in between are these other inferior groups. So they categorized the Irish into. In fact, there were some people who believed that the Irish had been descendant of Africans who sailed to Ireland from Africa like hundreds or thousands of years ago. It was completely false, but that's what they believed. So they show up in Ireland, and what they do essentially is enslave the Irish. And they create a plantation system. Is they send Protestants, British Protestants like Englishmen, Scots over to be the landowners, and they're going to rule over the land, and then the Irish are going to be the peasants. They're not like actually enslaved like African Americans, where it's not that type of slavery. But if you're poor and you're forced to work on the land and you have no other options, you're essentially kind of a slave, right? I wanted to start with this because the Irish are going to account for probably the largest immigrant group during the 1800s. And do you think the Irish are going to be treated very well when they come over? Not at all. But to understand Irish immigration in the U.S., you have to understand what the Irish were coming from and how people felt about the Irish. So we know right off the bat, the British, they almost in a way see the Irish as subhuman, right? What country were we colonized by? Great Britain. So do you think that culturally we're going to have a lot of similarities with the British?
Yeah.
Do you think we might have some of the same stereotypes and beliefs about the Irish that the British people did?
Yeah.
Probably. Okay, how about, does the word genocide appear?
Yeah.
All right, that's a pretty big accusation, right? Genocide, that's like got to be one of the worst words out there. Genocide. There's a lot of historical debate as to whether what happened in Ireland was actually genocide. But that's the accusation made in the article, right? There are accounts of these British landowners that lived in Ireland. They go out hunting. And they be out hunting on a hunting trip, and they just see some poor Irishmen working out in the fields, and they shoot them, just for the fun of it. They did not treat the Irish well at all. Now we're like, the genocide accusation really comes in, has to do with the Irish potato famine. The famine itself was naturally occurring. But what some historians say is the British didn't really do anything about it. They were perfectly fine with letting the Irish suffer and die. In fact, I think it was in 2010, an international human rights court ruled that the Irish potato famine had been a genocide because of the lack of response from British authorities. Another thing that kind of comes out in a situation like this, I had a really good college professor put it this way: oftentimes stereotypes are true. Like when stereotyping is probably the quickest way you like divide yourself from another group and then kind of like look down upon them or dehumanize them. Right, we're all familiar with stereotypes, right? Right, we've all heard that term. He said, stereotypes are often true, but there's a reason that they are true. So, for example, the Irish, they were looked at as they're subhuman because they're dirty, they're filthy, they're poor. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They're not as intelligent. They don't have the mental capacity that other white people have. Because, but it was kind of true in a way, because if you went to Ireland and saw how the Irish people live, they oftentimes lived in like sod houses, and they wouldn't have they wouldn't have a lot of the features of a house that you would normally see. But one thing that the British did is they put they put an extra tax on your house if you had like glass in your windows or like a certain type of door, right? So they found ways to make it hard for Irishmen to like actually have a good standard of living. So then when the Irish come over, they're looked at as these kind of dirty, dumb subhumans. Another way they did that were the penal codes, the Irish penal codes. What happened there? They weren't able to hold public office. They weren't able to practice their religion freely. Yeah. So there were different systems put in place to really hold the Irish back. And that's really part of British society, and that carries over to America when they come over to America. So I'm going to play a couple videos now. I'm going to play a couple videos that are going to kind of help illustrate
What do you have?
Two Bud Lights, please. Actually,
Yeah, you can go ahead and do that.
They're just considered Americans. But when they first came to the country as refugees, they were seen as an infestation, a plague. Here's why Americans hated, but now love, the Irish. It all started with potatoes, or lack thereof. By the mid-1840s, the average adult in Ireland ate over 10 pounds of potatoes per day, they didn't have much of a choice. After centuries of oppressive British rule, most Irish lived in poverty. Potatoes were easy to grow, packed with nutrition, and, most importantly, cheap. But in 1845, a fungus began to eat its way through Ireland's precious crops. The potato plant started to shrivel, and Ireland's British overlords didn't seem to care. The Great Hunger lasted until 1852. By the time the famine ended, some 1 million Irish had died from starvation and disease. By 1855, nearly 2 million had fled, the majority of them to the United States. The Irish encountered much resistance in the U.S. for several reasons, including religion. Most of the Irish immigrants to the U.S. were Roman Catholic, and there had long been bad blood between Protestants and Catholics. Some Protestants believed this exodus of Irish immigrants was a papal army, seeking to overthrow the U.S. government and establish a new Vatican in Cincinnati. Others just worried that these newcomers would take their jobs. As with every wave of new immigrants, most of the Irish who came to the U.S. during this time ended up taking dangerous, low-paying work. Irish Catholics also brought their love of the drink. Irish-owned pubs popped up across the country, giving the new immigrants a foothold in the economy, but also leading to an ugly stereotype: the Irish as job-stealing, drunk cretins. Discrimination was rampant. Entire political parties sprung up to fight this perceived Irish menace. Members of the so-called American Party referred to themselves as know-nothings, because when questioned about their membership, they claimed to know nothing. But they had a very active agenda, and vowed to only elect native-born Americans. No, not them, just the non-Catholic whites. They also started violent riots and picked street fights in Irish Catholic neighborhoods. But after years of discrimination, the Irish fought back, not in the streets, but at the ballot box. Their sheer numbers gave them strength. They voted Irish Catholics into powerful political positions across major East Coast cities. At the same time, non-Irish Americans also started to come around to the whole Irish pub thing. And as the Irish moved up the social ladder, nativists, like the know-nothings, shifted their prejudices to the next wave of immigrants from China and Eastern Europe. The Irish became Irish Americans, and non-Irish Americans started to act more Irish, or at least how they thought the Irish acted. Today, Irish traditions, including music, dance, and drink, have been woven into the fabric of American society. So the next time you fly an Irish flag on St. Paddy's Day, remember what Americans once hated and feared is now a staple of our culture.
Okay, I'm going to give you a pretty stark example of the level of discrimination the Irish faced.
The Irish, when they first arrived, were considered the lowest of the low by most Americans. They were very poor. Most of them were illiterate, or semi-illiterate. They congregated in slums, and they were blamed for that. As a result, the reputation of the Irish suffered. So most Americans developed, through the things they read in the newspapers and also through political cartoons, a very negative impression of the Irish. To the extent that some Americans saw them as worse than the other group, that they certainly had very low opinion of African Americans. We tend to think of the derogatory cartoons of African Americans showing them as apes or as chimpanzees. If you look at the mid-19th century cartoons of Irish Americans, they are shown in almost the exact same way, as animalistic, simian features, very ape-like, to convey a very powerful sense that these are people who are not fully human. The other thing that's interesting about this is that Irish and blacks tended to share the same neighborhoods. So if you went to the Irish neighborhood in New York, that was also where Little Africa was located. So there was a lot of fear among outsiders that there was a lot of racial intermixing, a lot of interracial marriage, and a lot of interracial sharing of cultures and so on. We see today that this is what ultimately produces something like tap dance, which is a combination of Irish steps and African traditional steps born in a place in New York City, an Irish black neighborhood. But at the time, this is seen as a supreme threat to white middle-class America.
So for hundreds of years, they had been treated as second-class citizens by the British. Then the potato famine comes along. What they say the numbers, like just in the 1840s, they said like 1 million people alone died. 1 million people died in Ireland. Ireland, I think today, it's a little bit smaller than Iowa. I think today has about 5 million people. I don't know what the population was back then. I think it was kind of similar. But can you imagine, like, just within Iowa, 1 million people dying? Like that'd be a lot of people. And then a lot of other people immigrated out of the country. The famine was so bad that you had millions of people dying. We watched the video of Venezuela yesterday. That's kind of like Venezuela's problems on steroids, right? Because in Venezuela, you have people who can't get enough to eat. The example we saw in the video yesterday was those two parents. They alternate a meal every other night so their kid has enough to eat. But I like to use these examples because whether it was 150 years ago or today, a lot of times these immigrants are coming from very harsh realities back home, humanitarian crises. So we could say, famine, hardship, similarities between Ireland back then, Venezuela today. So I think a couple of you may have answered. If you haven't, go back into the journal, answer that last question. Tomorrow, we'll see what happens tomorrow. We praying for a late start. I think a snow day is pretty overly ambitious. I think you ought to be out there doing a snow dance. And so we'll see how much time we have tomorrow. But next week, I'd kind of like to shift the focus to immigrant stories, immigrant experiences, like kind of beginning back in the 1800s, and what their experiences are here in America. But what I wanted to show you more importantly is why are they coming to America in the first place, and what are the global the global influences or factors that are sending people here. This is an American history class, but so far this year, do you think we have studied more American history or almost more world history? More world. Considering last semester, we've already started on this semester, can you even really study or understand American history without understanding world history? I think it's pretty inaccurate. I'm obviously biased history nerd up here, but I think it's almost criminal the way we teach history today, because you guys as high schoolers are required to take American history and then government. Right? Those are your two required social studies classes in high school. But I don't think you can really understand American history at all unless you understand a lot of world history. I don't think you really can. Because it's not like America exists in a vacuum and there's no influences right now going on, influences that happened before America was even a country that really dictate Americans. I don't think you can understand it at all. I think you have a faulty understanding. If I had kept a strictly American history, could I have accurately covered all that Cold War history without bringing in a ton of world history? First of all, you guys probably would have been lost. Like, so much stuff you wouldn't have understood. You wouldn't have understood, why we did certain things. That's why I think in high school you should take world history as a freshman, get some understanding of world history before you take American history. But it's my opinion, not that it matters at all. Another thing, let's see, you guys took, recent American history last year, right? That was 1860s onward. The situation like the Irish immigrants, was that something you had covered in any class? Did you cover it last year?
The nobodies.
The know-nothings?
Know-nothings, yeah, we covered that.
Okay.
Some.
So you guys at least had some understanding of, because I think especially today when we look at just immigration, for example, and just the U.S. In general, do we tend to kind of think of it as white people and not white people in terms of like social issues, immigration? It's like you're either white or you're not white, or am I looking at it the wrong way? You kind of get what I'm saying? But that's really kind of an inaccurate picture because I'd say probably up until like World War II, it wasn't as simple as being white. You had to be white, but you had to check off some other boxes too. You had to be from Northwestern Europe, and you couldn't be Catholic. Right? You really could not be Catholic. That's another example. Well, why should we understand world history to understand American history? Revolutionary War happens in the 1770s. The 15 and 1600s, do we know what's going on in Europe? That time period, 1600s, the Reformation, right, where thousands of people were being killed over religion. It was basically a split between the Protestants and the Catholics. Now, once again, to understand America, you kind of have to understand some world history, understand what culture we came from. We're basically a product of British culture. Are the British Catholic or are they Protestant? They are Protestant. The Church of England broke away from the Catholic Church. You know the famous story of King Henry VIII? The Pope won't let him get a divorce from his wife because his wife won't have a son. So he decides to get divorced. The Pope won't let him. So he says, well, I'm going to break away from the Catholic Church. So they become the Church of England. They do not like Catholics. The Irish are Catholics. So that's another thing where it wasn't as simple, in the 1800s, it wasn't as simple as you being white. People found they got very creative in the way they found to discriminate others. Well, you had to be a certain kind of, you couldn't be Irish, you couldn't be Catholic, you couldn't be Italian, you couldn't be Polish. They came up with terms for all those people. The Irish, they called them, mix or patties? The Italians, they called wops. The Polish, they called Polacks. Now, today, no one bats an eye when I say those things, but in the 1800s, those were pretty racially charged terms. They really were. Something to think about as we move forward.